All right, I'm here with Peter at the NDC London conference, and we're going to ask some questions about authorization or about security in general. So how about you tell me why it is extremely important to think about security when creating an application?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The thing is that at some point in time, most applications need to do user authentication because you need to have a knowledge of who your users are and what they're really able to do. And that becomes kind of like the point at which most folks will reach for, I'm going to build a user ID and password dialogue, and it's going to be a login box.
Right.
And that's the point at which you open up a landscape of a world of potential hurt if you're not careful. The first thing is obviously that once you do that, you're opening yourself up to attack from bots, from credential stuffing, from all of the things that potentially could impact your application and your reputation.
Mm-hmm.
But then the security landscape changes on such a regular basis and new technologies come along. So, for example, one of the latest technologies, which is an evolution of WebAuthn, is passkeys.
Right.
And actually building stuff like passkeys into your application, even doing things like kind of authenticating with upstream IDPs like Facebook or LinkedIn, or even doing enterprise federation if your applications go B2B, is really completely different from just validating credentials from a user ID and password perspective. So not only do you open yourself up to all the potential threat landscapes if you build it yourself, you're more than likely going to end up very quickly throwing it all away to start all over again.
So what I got from that is essentially you're recommending that people buy versus build, right?
Absolutely. Now, obviously, I work for Auth0, and we have a customer identity solution called Auth0.
Right.
Most people, I think, have probably heard of Auth0, but if you haven't, it is a customer identity solution that's kind of sold by Auth0.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I work for them, so of course I would say, yeah, buy Auth0. But the reality is there are lots of other solutions that you could look at on the market. And it depends, well, I guess on your budget, but also how complex you need to get. But the bottom line is, whether you choose Auth0 or not, please don't build it yourself to start with. Really consider actually going out there and buying and integrating with an identity solution with a provider whose job is identity. Because let's face it, you're building an application that's probably not an identity application, so you want to focus on building the features and functions in your app.
And I think that actually follows through with even more granular kind of permissions, because authentication, obviously, you're making sure that person is who he really claims to be.
Yeah.
But then also we can get far more granular with how we secure our application. And then we jump into authorization, specific roles, assigning those roles. And obviously, for example, 10 years ago, people built their own authentication. Now the common practice is to use other authentication vendors. Same thing, I think, is happening for authorization. People and engineers are starting to realize that, roles are important. It's a critical part of security. Managing very fine-grained authorization is very, very difficult to do. And if you build it yourself, you're probably going to have to rebuild it, right?
Correct.
So my next question is, how granular do you think people need to get with the security of their applications?
It's a really good question. Another really good, but you just have a whole range of really good questions.
I've got it.
So actually, you said something there that's really interesting. You touched upon authorization. Well, you talked about authorization, but you touched upon roles. And most people, when they look at authorization from the perspective of what can this person actually do, they look at something called role-based access control. It's what we're most familiar with.
Yep.
Role-based access control for a lot of applications is perfectly fine. So in answer to your question, how granular do you need to get? Sometimes role-based access control is all you need. But in other scenarios, there's much more complicated authorization models that you need. And that's where something like relationship-based access control comes into play. Relationship-based access control allows you to describe exactly what it says, relationships between objects. So I could be, okay, I have a role, I'm in the IT department, but it might be that I'm working remotely. It might be that I'm working out of hours. It might be that I'm seconded as part of some other part of the organization. And you soon get into the weeds when you start with a role-based access control system. And if that's how you built it internally yourself, where that doesn't scale and that doesn't kind of open itself up to relationships.
Yeah,
so
100%.
The answer to your question depends on your application, how complicated you need to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the audience there, just to kind of let them imagine what relationship-based access control is. The way I like to think about it is a graph.
Yes.
It's nodes and edges.
Absolutely.
And how you kind of cascade down those nodes and edges to inherit or, as I should say, derive the permissions, right?
I love that description because that's exactly what relationship-based access control is. Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. And how do you see... Actually, let me change the question. So authorization, it appeared on the OWASP top 10 list as number one for the past 2 years, I think, at this moment.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
I think the interesting thing with authorization is a landscape that's changed over a period of time. And it's a lot of emphasis has been focused really on authentication. And I think authentication has kind of like been done.
Yes.
Right?
And now it's authorization.
And now it's authorization.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about authorization was when Auth0 came into the mix, it gave this added kind of dimension to authorization with the whole idea of delegated authorization, where I, as a user, am actually giving permissions to the application to do things on my behalf.
Right.
So that's how, like, the authorization landscape has changed from what I'm allowed to do to what I also allow something to do on my behalf. And yeah, authorization, I think, is becoming, and certainly the focus is really, it's the new landscape that authentication was a few years back.
Yeah, so it's the new kid in the block, right?
It's the new kid in the block. Yeah, absolutely.